Our group got the opportunity to discuss question 3 and whether to realize if there should be an environmental bottom line. And it was a very dynamic discussion. But at the end of the day, I think we've come to the realization if there's going to be any room for the industry to sort of continue, we've assessed that there should be an entity, an independent entity, to engage into the practice of assessing the environmental repercussions that the industry is going to have. And if I may go back to my notes for a second. And what was discussed in the prior segment, have an environmental bill of rights, the assessment for mining from every aspect, environmental, social, culturally, and even financial as well. And also where this is funding going to come from, and perhaps have if there's any companies interested on this, perhaps make them accountable. And also we also talked about the aspect of creating awareness and in making the constituency decide whether or not there should be a bottom line and how deep of a threshold we should have. And that's, I think, is very important because at the end of the day, it's if we allow a mining company to come into X community and start using the water from their water source and leave after a 2-year project, are they going to find ways to reparate the impact, or is there going to be a solution, or we're going to have to wait 500 years before water is sort of like drinkable once again, or being able to use it? So that's the question at large here. Is there an opportunity for a bottom line, or is it just a way to say no to mining, no to the industry, right? It has to be put to their table. It has to be make sort of aware. And I think this is on a personal note, it is the vehicle to go. Educate people. Obviously we have the tools, the legislation, but if people don't realize about that there's these tools, we'll never be able to exercise or even enforce any of it, because we need the power of the people to find ways to actually make the change happen. So if we don't educate, if we remain ignorant of it, it will never happen. And like the industries are going to cater to what they're supposed to do, enlarge the pockets for the shareholders, the revenues, right? Makers, and that's what it is. And I think if there's going to be a bottom line, if there's going to be any room at all for industry to come about, a large degree of responsibility should be pressed on them. Also, I'm not sure if perhaps I'm not an expert on this, and maybe someone can perhaps field this question. The bill C-300 is being at the stage of second reading right now at the House of Commons, where it calls for social responsibility on corporations. Will this be one of the tools to make the change? And obviously, can we make the constituency aware of this? And how can we link that? So that's, in a way, the spectrum, like what we talk about. So thanks.
Maybe we can come back to Bill C-300 in the general discussion. I just want to add a couple more things that arose out of our group. The suggestion was made that we really need to start doing full cost accounting and assessing mining projects. So valuing ecological services. What are the value of clean water, or an intact, functioning lake? Secondly, we talked briefly about something that hasn't been raised a lot even yesterday, and that is the question of alternatives to mining. A basic premise of environmental assessment is that a good environmental assessment includes alternatives, and not just alternative ways of doing the project, but alternatives to doing the project at all. Do nothing, other ways of securing minerals, for example, mining landfills, the possibility of decreasing consumption, and rethinking our priorities in terms of what's more important, gold jewelry or an intact environment. And finally, the question of future generations, so looking at the timeline of economic development, so that we know in so many environmental issues, and certainly in mining, there's this false dichotomy set up between jobs and environment, and the economic benefits of mining are sold to communities, but we don't always think about the timeline. Is this a 2-year benefit for a 100-year detriment? Is this a lake that could have produced economic development, indefinitely into the future, and now we're going to get 5 years of mining income, and then the lake is no longer economically productive ever again? So those are some of the other themes that we talked about in that group.
Another group. The one that was down here, perhaps. The big group.
Down here, that was our group.
Yeah. Thanks, Catherine.
We had a real lively group, and I'm going to put out a bunch of things that were said, and probably none of them was there unanimous agreement on. So just so you know that in advance. So one of the things that was put forward was just in response to the question would be that no natural water body should ever be used for mine waste disposal. That would be a bottom line. Another thing that was put forward was that really what needs to happen is there needs to be public outreach. There needs to be a public process and a public discussion, debate that would lead to higher level principles before any of these questions can be answered. Another point that was put out was that we need a federal or national environmental bill of rights for Canada, Canada-wide. And going back on this public debate, later there was a suggestion made that academics should lead this public debate, just so you know.
We'll get right on that.
Yep, right. There was a point made about the need for coherence of public policy with commercial policy, and later that was interpreted as trade policy and human rights. Apparently the Netherlands is trying to work through how that could be done. There was another suggestion made that human rights should be the basis of any environmental policy, but that policy, sorry, not just for any environmental policy, but for all policies that in Canada, and including environmental policy. There was a suggestion made that we should include in the Environmental Bill of Rights, the former suggestion, the 4 principles from the natural step, which is, some of you may be familiar with. It's something you can Google and look up and find out what the natural step is about. And one of the things that's in the natural step is the precautionary principle, so that would include the precautionary principle then. There was also a suggestion made that we need to be careful. I am interpreting this a little bit as not to kill the goose that lays the golden eggs. In other words, that we have to recognize that these changes, that the mining sector itself should be held responsible to operating at the highest environmental and human rights levels, but that it's also the mining industry itself that needs to do that, so it still needs to be there in order to be able to accomplish these goals. And the person who suggested this said that the industry absolutely has the ability to meet the highest environmental and human rights standards. There was another suggestion made that what we really should be focusing on, the biggest environmental problem we're facing globally, is the synergistic effects of manufactured chemicals and what those manufactured chemicals are, the impacts that they have on our lives. And then there was also a suggestion made that there needs to be a full cost accounting principle, and so it's nice to hear that that came out in another group as well. And we talked about that a little bit in terms of when would the full cost accounting be done, and that it should be done before a mine is started. So it'd be part of the actual process of deciding whether a mine should go forward in a particular location or in a particular community. There'd be a full cost accounting of all the environmental, social, cultural, etc. costs, as well as the benefits. Yeah, that was it.
Thank you very much, Catherine.
I said we weren't going to have a very objective discussion about uranium because of my pre-existing stance on uranium. Mining Watch has I work for Mining Watch, and Mining Watch has a policy on moratorium for uranium mining in Canada. We didn't talk too much about that. There were some questions that were raised. Does that mean that if we don't accept uranium mining, that we wouldn't accept nuclear power? And given that that's part of Ontario's current energy mix, does that just mean that we're exporting our requirement for uranium? My response to that was that I and Mining Watch aren't too keen on nuclear power either. I also sort of tried to whiffle around that a little bit by saying that the uranium that's in Saskatchewan is much richer and requires less energy and less waste to be created by mining it. So it would be a more efficient choice to use uranium from there rather than the low-grade uranium that's in Ontario. What else did we talk about with uranium? That was... about it around uranium. And then we talked a lot about actually sort of accountability mechanisms, talking about the need for some sort of federal equivalent to the Environmental Commissioner's Office. And we recognize the good work that the AGO does, but that they're also very constrained by just critiquing application of current policy rather than really critiquing policy itself. And so it would be nice to have some sort of forum for that. And
Could you talk a little bit about the basis for Mining Watch's concerns regarding uranium for people that may not be familiar, or people that may be watching this when we become a box office hit?
oh, I should have
On YouTube.
shaved this morning or something. So it's largely around long-term risks of uranium mining, given that the wastes that are generated by mining uranium have the potential to last in the tens of thousands of years. We don't feel confident that we have systems in place to manage safely those wastes for that length of time, and certainly that we haven't accounted for the costs and risks of mining, or of managing those wastes into the future. There are a variety of risks associated with the actual mining of uranium as well. I've just been brushing up on this actually, and I was amazed to read one of the most definitive statements I've ever read in terms of epidemiology coming out of Germany, a statement in a public health journal that said, mining uranium causes lung cancer, period. This article will look at other health impacts of uranium mining, and actually the other health impacts they were looking at, they decided it wasn't really a significant contributor to. But I was amazed that in the preface to this article, they said, uncategorically, which for an epidemiology is very rare, that mining uranium causes lung cancer in the miners. And there's also issues around contaminating wildlife around mine sites and things like that, and waterways as well. Containing radioactive wastes is very challenging. So that's our main concern. We also have concerns about the use of uranium in nuclear power, the nuclear fuel cycle, nuclear weapons, depleted uranium being spread around Iraq and Afghanistan, et cetera. But given that we're Mining Watch, we do tend to focus mostly on the mining aspect. Just as an example of a bottom line, I mentioned the U.S. is currently reforming their U.S. 1872, so they're even 1 year older than the Ontario Mining Act. Their Mining Act is from 1872, so they're reforming that. And one of the bills that's going through one of the two houses, I can't remember which one, has a clause in it that would prevent any mine from opening that couldn't show that 10 years post-closure, so 10 years after the mine is productively done, if that mine requires ongoing what's called perpetual care and maintenance, so that means somebody's got to be on site managing a water treatment facility or making sure things are still operating. If a mine can't show that the geology of the minerals and the closure technology is such that there won't be the need for ongoing treatment, that mine wouldn't be able to open. Which would shut down a lot of sulfide-bearing mines in particular. I'm not necessarily, I'm still trying to get my head around that, so I'm not suggesting that we adopt that yet, but I think it's a really interesting question to put out.
Thank you very much.
I think there was.
We talked about question 4 a lot, and we had a lot of the same concerns about how we use uranium and mining it. And so our general consensus was that, yes, there should absolutely be a moratorium, if only to give us an opportunity to stop and think about what we're doing with uranium. And we decided that really how we use uranium isn't a debate that can be separated from should we be mining uranium. Someone had actually talked about the experience of Brazil and how Brazil kind of jumped on the nuclear power bandwagon a few years ago. And they started building plants, and then they had the debate, should we be mining uranium and what are we using it for, and decided that no, they probably shouldn't be. But by that time, the factories were up, and once you have your plants up, it's very, very hard, if not impossible, to go back. And so really, a moratorium would provide us with an opportunity to look at where's our uranium going? Are we exporting it? Who are we exporting it to? What do they need it for? What are we using it for in Canada? Do we need to mine at least a little bit of uranium? Those sorts of things. And that through studying that, we could then be in a better position to evaluate evaluate our practices. As well, we could be looking at alternative uses of uranium. Because there's this kind of dialogue that happens that sees uranium as a source of clean energy, and it may not be carbon emitting, but there's certain other issues that were talked about earlier. And so instead of just relying on uranium as a clean energy source, we could be looking at developing other technologies. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
If I could just quickly pick up on it. Nuclear power is one of the issues, the analysis of which really changes if we take an intergenerational perspective. Because, based on statistics in terms of safety of nuclear power plants, there's a credible argument to be made that we get an environmental benefit now. But as soon as you take an intergenerational perspective, it really, really changes. Because it's true, we get less air pollution than, from burning coal or something. But as soon as we start to think about, well, what about 2, 3, 4 generations out? It's not really a nice legacy that we're leaving. So sometimes the intergenerational perspective can enrich our analysis.
Yes, so we'd like to open the floor now for some general discussion. So people who wanted to add comments or had other questions, please come forward.
Cost analysis. Stumbled across a really interesting article that looked at life cycle cost assessments for different tailings options. So tailings are one of the types of waste that's generated by mining. And it's just one article, so I'm not suggesting it's definitive, but its conclusion was that if you projected, I think it was about 50 years into the future, no, it wasn't even, it was 20 years into the future. If you projected the life cycle costs of your tailings alternatives, ones that didn't require the taking of lakes and water bodies or water covers, so you weren't contaminating water in order to treat your waste, actually became cheaper up front. So perhaps more environmentally benign alternatives became cheaper if you applied a life cycle cost analysis because it allowed the companies to rehabilitate them faster. It didn't require somebody to be on site treating the water in perpetuity or even for 100 years or so. And so I think there's maybe an opportunity to engage industry in this discussion as well and say, if they are required to consider costs and there's the legislation there to require them to consider costs of their full operations, then it may be, in some cases anyways, cheaper of them to actually do the right thing. So I think it's a really fruitful area for discussion, and when we're talking about full cost, make sure we're talking about life cycle as well.
Well, let me put this question out there. Why aren't we doing full cost accounting? Because we've known, as a matter of science, we've known for a long, long time that, in fact, there is a very real dollar value on ecosystem services. And if you have to replace them, if you have to actually decontaminate water before you drink it, it's really expensive. So can somebody give us a sense, somebody with some real-world experience in the mining, why aren't we doing this?
We wouldn't have very many mines.
They would not be open.
The other problem with the whole issue on environmental liability is something that has been getting discussed by accounting groups around the world, and it's moving up the list. The problem is, how do you assign a cost? Okay, because the thing is, once you start assigning the cost to the inputs and also to the outputs, whether it be the waste and also for what is a ton of clean air worth in manufacturing? What is clean water input coming into? Like people are talking about the oil sands. If you look at the value in the oil, I keep telling people forget the oil value, look at the water value. That's way out there. If you're giving large firms set water rights, those water rights in 20 years could easily exceed the value of the oil rights.
Yeah.
The problem is once you start assigning it, you have who's going to establish the cost, okay, and the value of this product. And that's only at the very preliminary stage of the stuff. I'm just going to jump into one other thing. So that's one of the issues on environmental liabilities and costing. Okay, and that will change industries overnight. There's some of these that everybody's like, hey, it's profitable. Mining may not. Some projects will remain viable. Some won't. Once you start costing it. Same thing with the nuclear energy. Once you start costing these elements, they can change the whole dynamics, but are people also willing to pay the price? That's another key point. If you're talking about mining, I take a look at an old Auditor General report in 2002 on abandoned mines in the north. The government of Canada was required to put up $3.5 billion for remediation costs. on abandoned mines. Once a mine is, the economic value is removed from it, if there's any type of liability and it's not properly bonded, that liability is going to flow back to the government of Canada and taxpayers. That's at federal level. We have the same issue on a provincial level. Anyway, so those are some of the things to bear in mind.
Thank you very much, that's helpful.
If I could just take us back one step.
Sure.
On the same issue of full costing and deal with both 3 and 4. In our group, we discussed one other concept that really wasn't elaborated on, and that's co-management as a process. And in the north, you've got co-management arrangements built into the constitutional framework for how decision-making occurs, how permitting occurs, how mining, forestry, everything is subject to a co-management regime, which sets out environmental values and full costing requirements explicitly in the legislation and the statute and in the Constitution, because it's protected under Section 35 of the Constitution Act, all of these agreements. So looking at that, you never would have had what you do have in the Northwest Territories had it been in place, which is Delaney. And that brings it to number 4. Delaney is called the Village of Widows. And the reason is because the Dene men hauled yellowcake out of Port Radium, right, onto barges all the way down the Mackenzie River to Yellowknife, right, where it was offloaded, sent across by other barges and downstream. They all died, okay? And there's next to no men or grandparents or male line in that community, okay, still today. And they're still remediating that situation now. But co-management does exist in that area, right? In the Satu region, there's a co-management board. It's quite aggressive. They do permitting and they do this, that, and the next thing. There's a land use advisory board, and technically they're all advisory to ministers. But if they know how to use their groundswell consensus-based approach to things, you just don't get the Delaney situations. You will get water permitting for diamond mines, because there's a vested interest in the communities themselves. You will get that happening. Some of it wise, some of it not. But the principle of co-management seems to me is critical to the success of any of this. And that's community control at a reasonable level of aggregation. So I just want to leave that with you.
I have three comments, try to keep them very short. Uranium raises a very interesting issue. If you look at what happened at Charlotte Lake, they were mining an ore that I think was 0.04% uranium. And I think it's something like 4% in Saskatchewan, which means there are lots of associated minerals in Saskatchewan, not to mention in those other areas. If you actually put a ban on mining or exploring for uranium, what about if you're actually exploring for and mining a different mineral from the same ore body? The other 0.0, the rest of the 99 point whatever percent. And if you're actually not mining uranium, then there's a far greater likelihood that your tailings will include higher concentration of uranium than if you're mining uranium. So focusing on particular issues can raise complications that are often forgotten when you pursue things on a single basis. Another related part is that, and it relates partly to experience with Charlotte Lake and broader issues, we've got 43 mines in Canada. We have something like 10,000 exploratory activities that take place for every mine that's actually developed. The exploratory activities are profoundly important. And in the case of uranium, if you go drilling, you can actually affect aquifers, you can cause the flow into wells, and we've seen some evidence that suggests that the contamination of wells, the raising of levels in houses in their well water to well above the standards occurs when aquifers are, multiple aquifers are penetrated. So I don't think we should actually focus only on the uranium mining, and I certainly don't think we should focus only on the mining. The exploratory activities are vastly more influential. Second thing, on full cost accounting, I think it's absolutely vital that one looks where the money flows. As I mentioned in my group, Ontario 2 years ago had the biggest extraction of minerals ever, which was $10.7 billion. We have 43 mines in Ontario. We have 1,400 mining companies listed on the TSX. The majority of the world's mining companies locate here, not to mine here, but to mine elsewhere. The value of stock on the TSX is $380 billion. The trading of that stock alone generates commissions that's vastly in excess of the $10.7 billion. So if one looks where the money is in a deeper sense, one has to look at where the influence occurs. Someone in our group mentioned the possibility of, he was doing some work looking at what happens, I think it was Denmark, was I right on that? And trying to get Parliament more involved in the process of looking at broad impacts, broader context. I would argue that the democratic process is fundamentally flawed. And we can see that in an advanced country like Canada where, as I mentioned earlier, of the 100 or so amendments that were put forward by opposition members in the Ontario legislature, most of them were not considered at all, of an overwhelming majority. So we've got an incredible control over the so-called democratic process, and I would argue predominantly by those who have an interest in mining in this case. So I think if we're going to have change, one has to look far more deeply at the process by which the democratic process is put in place. And that's why I have argued earlier and would reiterate that what we really need to do is to do an analysis of that whole process, of the influence as it affects mining. And we then have to find a way, and that has to be done independently of existing systems, because the existing systems are so controlled, including in many ways by those who are in universities who get funding from those established vested interests. So what I argue is we need to have a much broader review of what really is going on in the financial, economic, and other influence processes, and then get that message conveyed with credible authority to a broad public. That way, it becomes potentially possible to influence the democratic process, the so-called democratic process. And I think that's the fundamental flaw here. Tinkering within a flawed process, I don't think gets the results.
If I could pick up on the question of the financial aspects of things, it does occur to me, and we talked about this yesterday, and I talked about this last week, that in the absence of Marxist revolution, if capitalism is a given, we do need to mobilize capitalism to work for us, because right now we're very much fighting this overwhelming tide of capitalist market forces. And some of you may know that the University of Ottawa houses a project called Sustainable Prosperity, whose ambitious goal is to actually retool the Canadian economy so that it is sort of self-perpetuating in sustainability. But on just a pragmatic note, if anybody is watching this video, it seems to me that if someone was to start a mutual fund that had truly good screening practices in terms of social and environmental responsibility, this person would become pretty rich pretty soon, because there's a market for this. And at this point, it's unsatisfied. We have nowhere to go. It used to be that people that worked in the environmental field had no money to invest. And now there is a middle class of environmental professionals, whether we're comfortable with that or not. That's a reality. And there is money to be invested, and we don't have options. So, maybe we need to be taking this message into the business schools and into the accounting schools, and I don't even know where. But I do know that as long as capitalism is out there, we can't just fight against it and we can't ignore it. We have to actually harness it, I think.
Go a little bit back. I like to, my group was focused in uranium mine. I like to go a little and together try to think about first question. For me, of course, the answer is yes. But I think I have another question. How? Because how we measure harm, how we measure environment and social harm of a project. And right now, this is based in environment and social impact assessment. That is the main instrument. And that instrument is an old instrument. It's an instrument that needs to be improved. And I have some experience not only reading about, but also deal with this instrument. And I tell you, I never see environment and social impact assessment that say, no, this mine need to be stopped because the impacts are more than the benefit. I never see. And you know why? Because when you go to these kind of studies, the assessment itself, in some cases, they are very good. But when you go for the risk assessment, when you put risk, impacts, and measures, almost of the time, you underestimate the risk. And of course, if you underestimate the risk, the conclusion is possible if we take these measures. And for me, it's very important that we improve that instrument. That is so basic, is so crucial for our decisions. And it's an old instrument. And I believe a lot of our regulation, and sorry, insisting that point, but I believe, in fact, regulations can be changed, can be improved, and have a good impact. And I think we need to look more our Environment and Social Impact Assessment Acts and propose some change. And go back a little bit about the uranium mine. Again, if I could, I would say no to any uranium mine, because the reasons that people from Mining Watch just explained to us. But the reality, and I'm sorry, I don't like to say that, but I think I should, I need to. The reality is, from one side, Canada is very rich in uranium deposits. That is one thing. The second is have a very strong demand for uranium. And this is in fact, increase the demand. For me, I think Canada have a problem. What to do with that? And as much I like close all the uranium mines, I'm not sure if it's possible. And my point is, okay, if it's not possible, how we can minimize, how we can protect our environment and our communities from the uranium mines. Don't need to have a very specific regulation and policy related with uranium mines that are different from the genetic mine. That in fact the requirements are more strict, the monitoring are more effective to be sure that the mines that we have, at least, are not cause environment and social damage. And for me, I think this is a challenge. I don't have the answer, but I'm very happy, in fact, and I like to contribute to improve that. It's not the perfect scenario, but possibly it's the realist scenario. And I think only we need, go and take the task. Try to improve the standards, how to mine a uranium mine. Thank you.
Thank you. Sophie?
We'll pursue the discussions we had amongst our groups. I just want to come back with uranium and just say how I think we should link the debate on uranium, moratorium on uranium mining, with the whole energy policy debate in Canada, and considering uranium mining into the whole fuel nuclear chain. And at the end of the 90s, the Canadians rejected nuclear energy as a source of energy and expressed their worries about storage of the waste, right, and the impossibility to have safe communities around nuclear waste. And in response to that, Canada created the Nuclear Waste Management Organizations that was presided by Elizabeth Dodswell, and also by representatives from the nuclear industry, and they held consultation, and I really put quotes around consultation, but I participated in them. And one of the issues we had was that the mandate of this commission was very, very narrow, in the sense that the only thing they felt they had to decide upon was how are we going to store the nuclear waste, saying we already have some, so we need anyways to have a solution. So let's discuss the solution. And lots of us insisted on the fact that you cannot discuss storage of nuclear waste if you don't discuss the whole nuclear fuel, right? So that the nuclear waste organization should also discuss the uranium mining at one end of the nuclear chain and its impact on indigenous communities, and then discuss energy production. Do we really want to have nuclear energy? And then finally you can come with the waste solution. So in other words, you can't decide on how to store nuclear waste without reopening the nuclear debate and make sure that, that Canadians all agree with the nuclear debate. So that's what I would propose, is that when we discuss uranium mining moratorium, it could be to focus on reopening the energy debate in Canada and seeing how does Canadians feel today about nuclear energy. If we invest billions of dollars in a waste facility, then it will be really hard to say stop producing nuclear energy, because we have the solution, we have a safe waste disposal, let's fill it up, right? Let's make it rentable. And if we exploit lots of uranium mining and we have all this uranium, it will be really hard to stop nuclear production. So we go nowhere without revisiting the energy debate. So.
That's great. I think it circles us back to one of the themes that has come up over and over again, and that is that in analyzing any environmental problem, we have to take a holistic approach. We have to look at the whole life cycle, not only of ecosystems, but also of human systems.
Absolutely, and I'd like to, at this point now, to thank everybody for taking their Saturday morning to come and engage in this discussion. We really appreciate the rich discussion and recommendations, some of which have come out, some recommendations that have come out of this. We'll be producing a report on this and on the workshop that will be posted on the web. We're also producing a video as well that's going to be posted. Thank you very much also to our workshop participants who've been here for 2 days and have done a lot. We appreciate your contributions very much. And thanks again to the rapporteurs, to Sam, Julian, Susanna, and Stanko for your help. And again to Jordana and Andrew for organizing these events. So now we have a light lunch that is going to be served, and we'll say enjoy the lunch, enjoy some talking, and please keep in touch and keep focused on this debate. It's very important. Thank you.
Thanks very much.